to the 802 Cable Hat Knit Along, video number 4. In this fourth part of our video series, we're going to move on to the numeral 2 in your cable. So when last we met, we talked about the ribbing, casting on and doing your ribbing. Today what we're going to do is do the transitional stitches out of the ribbing and setting you up into the pattern of the stitch. So setting up these seed moss stitches and this knitted divider, and then setting up the column for your numbers, and then doing the numeral 2, which is actually probably the most interesting and complicated of the numerals that you will do. After the numeral 2, the numeral 0 is actually very easy. And then the number 8 has an interesting twist where you do the crossover, so that adds one more little bit to the skill. But your numeral 2 is most interesting because we had to figure out how to do this raised bar to form the base of the 2. Then we're going to cable over a pair of stitches to here, set up another set of knit stitches here, and then cable them both in to create the rounded portion at the top of the number 2. So taking a look at your pattern, right after you get through the knit 1, purl 1 ribbing for 2.5 inches, there is a table here that has the 3 set up rows. Again, I've set this up in tables, so each row has its own row across the pattern, but each column is each element of the pattern, so that visually each column has one of the elements of the knitting. So the seed stitch is in a column, and then the cable itself is in a column vertically on the pattern, as well as visually on the hat itself. So the first set up row, row 1, is where you establish the different columns of stitches, and it is also the only row in the entire pattern where you are going to make one stitch. So by the time you are done row 1, you've got 80 stitches on now in the knit 1, purl 1 ribbing that you've just done. By the time you get done row 1, you will have 84 stitches left in total. So if you are doing this 5 needle knitting with 5 double pointed needles, as I've suggested, you're going to have 21 stitches on each needle. So let me just show you, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I will go through one needle, one round of the pattern on each of these rows, and show you that make one. So to me, whatever I am knitting an Aran cable sweater or project, this row, the setup row where you move from the ribbing to the pattern, is to me the most complicated, because you can't yet see where the patterns are going to be, and yet you're diverting from what has been the ribbing pattern. So it's hard to lock it in your mind, and you just have to sort of take it on faith that you're reading the pattern correctly. So the first 3 stitches are the seed moss stitch, and those will be the same as your ribbing stitches: knit, purl, knit. The next stitch is the knit 1 that forms the vertical boundary between the seed moss and the cable. So you knit 1. The next 12 stitches are then your, what is going to be the cable area. To get that set up, what we do is purl 2, knit 8, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and purl 2 again. The purl 2 on either end of that knitted area will remain the same. So the edges of the cable are always purl 2 on either end, with a knit stitch to the outside of it. That creates the frame for the working cable stitches, the 8 stitches that are your working cable stitches in between. Then we do the knit stitch, as I said, that divides it. And then here is where we do the other half of the seed moss stitch, and in this pattern there are 3 seed moss stitches at the beginning of the needle and 4 at the end. So at the other end, what we're going to do here is knit 1, purl 1, and then the way I make one for this stitch is to take the bar that's in between the stitches and pull it up on the needle, And then do what's called knit through the back loop. That is, you're going to attempt to make sure that that stitch is twisted and knit through it, and then purl one. I'll do that make one again. I don't need to do one on this side, but just to demonstrate for you, let me show you one more time how you do a make one as I'm doing them here. If you have a different method that you'd like to use, go right ahead. But the way that I'm doing it is to pick up the bar that's between the stitches and then insert the right needle, what's called through the back loop. That is, insert it like purlwise. Bring that left needle forward so now you have twisted the stitch and knit it. And now you have a knit stitch with a nice twist to it that's going to hold it nice and firm there. All right, we have completed the first row, and now there is 84 stitches on the needles. There is now 21 stitches on each of your 4 needles if you are knitting it in the round with 5 double-pointed needle set. Obviously, if you're using just 3 double-pointed needles with knitting with a 4th one, then you're going to have a different number of stitches, and if you're knitting circular, you can ignore that part of the conversation altogether. I do so admire circular knitting, and many of my friends are huge fans of it and swear by it, and it just never gelled with me. So we're all a little different that way, and that's quite all right. This works no matter how you get there, as long as you are knitting in the round and following the right number of stitches on the pattern. So the next 2 setup rows, you're not going to make any, you're not going to decrease any. There's no change in the circumference until you get up to the decreases at the very top of the hat. So here, the next 2 stitches, what we're just doing is getting that seed stitch well established. So for your first 3 stitches that are the seed moss stitch, you're now going to do the opposite of whatever the stitch was below. So you knit, purl, knit last time, you're going to purl, knit, purl this time. Then the 4th stitch is that knit stitch that forms the vertical frame to the cables. That's going to be the same in every row. And then you're into your 12 cable stitches. So there's 2 purl stitches. And we're just setting up the base here with 8 knit stitches. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. On the other end of those 8 working cable stitches are the other 2 purls, and then that vertical knit stitch, the frame stitch for it. And now we've got 4 seed moss stitches, so you're going to do the opposite of what you did last time. So you're going to purl, knit, purl, knit. So other than the seed moss stitch, in which in each row you'll be doing the opposite of what you did the row before, everything else on this setup row is the same as the prior row. You've got a knit, and then the knitted frame stitches. You've got the 2 purl stitches on either end, and the 8 working knit stitches in the middle. So we'll continue on and do that around the rest of the needles. And now we're on to the 3rd row, which is going to be feeling very familiar by this point, so you'd be good and comfortable. And I'll also note that we have been joined by the cat, which is absolutely imperative when doing a knitting video. I'm shocked and amazed that she has not made an appearance prior to this time. She is wondering who I am talking to, however. So the 3rd row, same thing we've been doing. So you're going to, those first 3 stitches are seed moss stitches, so you're going to do the opposite. You purl, knit, purl last time. So this time you are going to knit, purl, knit. Again, I knit in the continental method with the yarn on my left hand. Doesn't matter if you knit the American way with the yarn in your right hand, that's fine. Again, everybody does it differently. I do this solely because my Romanian great-grandmother taught me when I was just a kid, and so this is how I always did it. All right, so it's knit, purl, knit for the seed moss stitch. Knit that vertical frame stitch. There goes the cat. Your purl 2, knit 8. Those are your working cable stitches. your purl 2 on the other end of the cable stitch run, your knit 1, that's the vertical frame, and then now 4 stitches of seed moss stitch. So knit, purl, purl. And we continue with that around row 3. All right, so hopefully you're all feeling quite confident now that you've got this set up. And what you should be seeing is a little bit of seed moss, the vertical knit stitch, and this set of knitted stitches along the bottom here to set up your column with the little purls on the edges to set up the working stitches for the cable, followed by another vertical framing stitch and the 4 stitches of seed moss on this side. What we're going to move on to now is this horizontal bar that forms the base of the numeral 2. And it may seem counterintuitive, but what you're going to do is actually purl straight across all 12 of this cable area stitches. And we're going to do 2 rows of that. So you're going to continue to work in your seed moss stitch, followed by a knit, and then purl 12 all the way across here, followed by the knit and the 4 other seed moss stitches. So you're going to do that for 2 rows, and that's row 4 and 5, and those are the first 2 rows in the box that says in the table that's labeled as numeral 2. So you're going to go ahead, work in pattern to the set of 12 stitches for the cable and purl all the way across that. Do that for 2 rows, rows 4 and 5 of the pattern. So now you've completed rows 4 and 5 of the pattern, which are the first 2 rows in the numeral 2, and you should have a bar of purl stitches that's actually 2 rows of purl stitches going right across that set of 12 stitches for the cable area. Now you're going to complete rows 6 and 7, and those are the rows that make this bar pop out here, and they're going to be exactly the same as your setup rows. That is, you're going to do your seed moss stitch, your vertical knit stitch, and then you're going to purl 2, knit 8, purl 2, and then do the other vertical knit and your other seed moss stitches. So that's these 2 rows right here, and they are purl 2 with knit 8 in the middle. So go ahead and do those 2 rows, and then we'll pick up our cable stitches. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to start cabling. So finally we get to the cable row. And what we're going to do by cabling is this right here. It is a 2-stitch cable. If you do arrow knitting, or as your arrow knitting skills develop, you'll find that there are cables with 1 stitch, 2 stitch, 3 stitches, some really wide cables in some fancy patterns. What we do throughout this hat pattern is 2 stitches. And what you do to cable is that you pick up the stitches on your cable needle, and you, depending on which direction you want the cable to go in, you're either going to hold those stitches in front of the work or behind the work. Because of the direction we are moving these stitches across the fabric, we're going to pick up the 2 stitches before them and hold it behind the work so that our 2 stitches can move to the right to form this diagonal line of the numeral 2. In our particular cable that we're doing here, the first time around, what you're doing is you are picking up 2 knit stitches onto the cable, but once you shift them over to the other side, you're going to purl them so they become part of this background. Now the way that's written in instructions in a knitting pattern, and people have different ways of phrasing these, I did a fairly common way of phrasing it here, which is that I called this cable C2B. That means cable to back. It means that you're going to put 2 stitches on your cable needle and hold it in the back of the work, hold it behind your work. You don't twist it, you don't turn it, you just drop it parallel to the back of the work. Then you're going to knit 2 stitches from your regular needle. And then what I've called here P2CN is purl 2 from the cable needle. As we go on into the other numerals here and the other cables, make sure that you pay attention to these. It can be cable to back as it is here, or if we're going to be moving the stitches in the other direction, it may be cable to front, C2F. That means you hold the cable needle in front of the work. And instead of purl 2 from the cable needle, some of our cables have you knit the 2 from the cable needle, or knit 1 and purl 1 in one case. So just take a look at those. They always mean the same thing, that you're putting needles on the cable needle. This is what you're knitting or purling from your regular stitch, and then this is what you are knitting and purling from the cable stitch before you continue on with your regular stitches in the row. So we are now on row 8 of the pattern, and row 8 of the pattern is where your first cabling happens. And let me walk you through that. We're going to do the seed moss stitch, the vertical knit stitch, and then the pattern for the cabling is you're going to purl 6. You're going to put C2B, that's cable 2 back. So you're going to put 2 stitches on the cable needle and hold them in the back of the work. Knit the next 2 stitches on your regular needle, and then purl P2CN, purl 2 stitches from the cable needle, and then purl the last 2 stitches. So let's walk through that. I like to just stick my cable needle into the work to hold it. I've gone through my seed moss stitches and the vertical knit stitch. So now I'm going to purl 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now I'm going to cable 2 back. So the way that I do that is I take my cable needle and I put the next 2 stitches onto the cable needle and I hold them in back of the work. And then the instructions say knit 2, so then I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches that are on my regular needle. And then I'm going to purl 2 stitches from the cable needle. So I pull the cable needle up here. This is one of those wooden cable needles with little ridges, so it really holds on to these stitches, which can be a pain, but at the same time, you don't lose them. So I'm going to purl those 2 stitches. And then I'm going to purl the 2 remaining stitches on my regular needle. And what I have just done is crossed the knit stitches over 2 purl stitches. So I've just moved them, exchanged them 2 blocks to the right. Let's go on to the next needle and I'll run through that one more time. So I'm going to knit 1 and do my 4 seed moss stitches at the end here. And go on to the next needle. And I'm going to do my seed moss stitches, purl, knit, purl, and then my 1 vertical frame stitch. And then I'm going to purl 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I'm going to cable. So I'm going to cable 2 back. I'm going to take my cable needle, insert it in the next 2 stitches. I'm inserting it purlwise, sliding them off the needle, and leaving them to the back of the work. And I'm not turning them at all. I'm not twisting them. They're just sitting right in the back of the work, just as they were when they were on the other needle, and I'm just going to let them hang to the back. I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches that are on my needle, and then I'm going to purl the 2 stitches from my cable needle. P2CN, purl 2 from the cable needle. There's 1, and there is 2. And then I come back to my regular needle and I purl the last 2 stitches in that cable block. So go ahead and complete that around the row, and what you're doing in each of the other, there's 2 more repetitions to do, and what you're doing is Basically taking those 2 purl stitches, dropping them behind so that you can move the 2 knit stitches over and swap places with them. Now that you've completed the first cabling row, you're going to do the next row, and in this pattern, with one exception, and in just about every Aran pattern that you will work with, not always, but usually, the row after the cabling row is sort of a catch-up row or a setting row, and what you do is you just knit or purl everything just as it's presented. So in our case, what you're going to do is purl 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at which point you are to the stitches that you cabled. You're going to knit the 2 stitches that you had cabled to the right, and then go ahead and purl 4 right across the rest of that row. And you continue with that right around the rest of round 9. All right, you've completed row 9. So you've completed the first cable in row 8, and then row 9 was like the rest row where you just set those stitches up and we're ready to cable again. So here I've done my 3 seed moth stitches, my vertical knitting stitches. Now I'm doing just 4 purl stitches. And then I'm going to cable again to move those stitches another block to the right. So just as the instructions say, you're going to put 2 on the cable needle, cable 2 back. So you're putting 2 on the cable needle and holding them to the back of the work. Then you're going to take the needle and knit your 2 stitches off of the regular needle, and then you're going to purl the 2 from the cable needle. Again, this is a wooden needle with little notches in it, which really likes to grip those stitches, which means they won't fall off on you. There's one, and purl the other one. Then you purl the remainder of the way across that batch of cable stitches. So you have moved that diagonal line 2 more to the right. You're going to go ahead and complete that round in that same fashion. And then what you do is another rest row. That is a row in which you're going to purl and knit each of the stitches within the cable band, within that vertical cable column, exactly as they were, exactly as they present themselves. So you have made it through row 11 of the pattern, and what you've done is you have moved the diagonal line of the 2 over 2 sets of stitches, so 4 stitches now. You're going to do the last move of that diagonal exactly as you did the earlier ones. This time you're just going to purl 2, and then you're going to cable those next 2 back and move these diagonals over the last slot. So there's just 2 purl stitches now after you do this round between that and the cable, the knit stitches of the diagonal line of the 2. So go ahead and do round 12, which is your final moving of that diagonal line over 2 stitches. So now you have completed row 12 of the pattern, and what that has done is it has brought the diagonal portion of the 2 all the way over so that there's just 2 purl stitches and then that diagonal, the 2 knit stitches there. Now the next row, 13, would ordinarily be a rest row, and it is, but with a little added twist. So rows 13 and 14 are going to be identical. You're going to purl the 2 stitches, knit the 2 stitches from the diagonal, and then you're going to purl 4, but that's when we add this other element. That is, you have to knit 2 stitches over here to form the other half of that top of the curve of the 2. So what you're going to do for rows 13 and 14 is purl 2, knit 2, purl 4, knit 2 again, and that's that other little top of the crown of the 2, and then purl 2. You're going to do that for 2 rows, rows 13 and 14. So now you have set up the top of your 2, and we're ready for the very last row of the numeral 2, which involves 2 cable crosses. So what you have done here is you've completed your diagonal. You did 2 rest rows, but you also created 2 knit stitches over here to create the little top of the cap of the numeral 2. Let me show you on this other completed one what we will now be doing. What you're now going to do is move the 2 stitches from that little cap over this way, over to the right, while the stitches that came up from that diagonal move 2 stitches to the left. So you're going to make 2 cable crosses in the same row, moving first 2 of the stitches and then the other 2 of the stitches. And so one of those is going to have to be held in front because it's moving in a different direction. So it's a little bit different than the ones we've been doing so far. Let me demonstrate it for you now. You're going to start in on that cable pattern by purling 2, 1, 2. Now you're going to cable 2 to the front. So let me show you how you do that. Now you take your next 2 stitches, the 2 knit stitches from the diagonal of the numeral 2, and you put them on your cable needle and hold them in the front of the work. Now you're going to purl 2 from your regular needle, and then you are going to K2 from the cable needle. You're going to knit these 2 stitches that were on the cable needle. 1, 2. Now you have just moved those 2 stitches to the left. Now you have to move the other half of the crown of the 2 to the right. So you're going to put the next 2 stitches on the cable needle again, move them off of your regular needle, and you're going to hold them to the back of the work. Then you're going to knit 2, and then you're going to P2CN, that is, then you're going to purl the 2 from the cable needle. 1, squish that off there, 2. And there you go. Then you purl the remaining 2 stitches that are in that column of cable stitches. So what you've just done is completed the numeral 2 by moving the stitches from the diagonal back to the left and the stitches that you created to form that little tail, that little cap, over to the right. And that creates that curl of the top of the 2. So you go ahead and complete that around the round for the rest of the round on the other 3 panels. And after that, row 16, all you do for this, you continue with your seed moth stitch, your vertical knit frame, and then you purl 12 straight across here, and you have completed the numeral 2.